Hey, we're so grateful to be with both Jim Buffington and Joel Lightfoot, who are with the organization Bridges to Life. Jim serves as the Chief Operating Officer, and Joel serves as the Manager of Outreach. And so grateful that they've come to be with us to kind of talk about this ministry and its unique part as it deals with folks in the Texas prison system, but literally all over the country and now all over the world. Talk about Bridges to Life and what the organization does and what its mission is.
So the mission of Bridges to Life is to connect crime victims with offenders and then make our community safer. And so for me, I started out as a volunteer victim story where victims of crime come into the prison, usually 4 of the 14 weeks, to share our story. And what we have found is every time a victim shares their story, they start healing. And the connection to the offender is the offender gets empathy for the victim when they understand the victim's perspective. And of course, the end result of our mission is people don't go back to prison. 83% of our graduates don't ever go back to prison. And so it makes our community safer. So for me, I signed up. I was invited by a staff member to attend a graduation, which is the end of the 14 weeks. And I just listened to men after men, graduates, walk up to a microphone and share how they've changed, what they've learned, and what they're going to do differently. And it was sincere and it was real. And so I started volunteering to just share my victim story, which is my mom was murdered several years ago. And unfortunately, my dad was the offender. He hired some men to kill my mom.
Wow.
And so I've got both a victim perspective as well as the offender's family perspective. And what I've noticed is every time I share my story inside prison, again, I heal, but the inmates really connect with it, both from my victim perspective, but also from the offender's family perspective. A lot of offenders don't realize the impact of their choices has made on their own family, and they're actually victims of the crime.
Yeah, that's so good. Joel, talk about why it's important, in your view, to connect not only victims of crime, but perpetrators of crime together. And what's the impact of just that gathering? When you do that in the prison system, what do you see, and how do you kind of look at that?
Absolutely. Well, as a part of our 14-week program, we bring victims of crime in. Many of them are considered to be surrogate stories that it's not the victim of a crime sitting with their perpetrator, if you will, one-on-one, but a variety of different crimes being reflected in those victims. My sweet wife is one of our victim storytellers. Jim is one of the victim storytellers. They bring different stories of crime too, and they tell how it's impacted them throughout their life. And so I hear my wife's story being told regularly. I also see the community's perspective when somebody sees many of our volunteers won't initially announce themselves as victims of crime. They just want to come in, they want to help out, they want to see people's lives change. But then when they start becoming comfortable, when their perspective as they sit in these circle groups, these small groups with the offenders, they sit and they realize that this is just a person that, but for the grace of God, there go I, And so brave people like my wife get the opportunity to welcome even ex-offenders of crime. We have 3 different types of volunteers that come in with us: victims of crime, ex-offenders that want to come back and make a difference, and then people like myself that have never majorly been victimized or never spent any time incarcerated. And so my wife, in the last session, one of the most recent sessions, for example, said, "Oh, there's an ex-offender of crime that wants to volunteer, but he feels uncomfortable about his offense and how it might relate. He's actually an offender of a crime that I am the victim of." So the victim of her crime and him, the offender of a similar crime, got the chance to volunteer together in the same small group for the entirety of the 14 weeks. None of the offenders that are sitting in that small group know that she has been victimized in a similar manner as he has offended, but the healing that occurs as a result of that brave action to say, I want him to be my co-facilitator, if you will, and the growth and the healing that that happens as a result in that small group is profound.
That is so incredible. So Kind of think about this with me for a second. We've entitled this seminar Incarceration, Restoration, and the Role of the Church. And I'm listening to you guys talk, and I mean, you are going inside the prisons, so you are dealing with men and women that are incarcerated. But what you are doing is you're creating opportunities for real restoration and real time. But I want to look at that third idea. What is the role of the church, and how does the church come alongside? Jim, would you take a stab at that? How does the church come alongside an organization like Bridges to Life and make a profound difference in the work that you're already doing? God's already moving through what you're doing.
Absolutely. So the issue of forgiveness is key, both with volunteers as well as the perpetrators of crime. And the process of our program really goes towards our week 10, which is forgiveness, where the participant will write a letter to their victim, which they're not supposed to mail or anything like that.
Right.
But they go through the process of writing it. And what we've seen is when you write it, it's a form of confession. And then you read that letter to your small group. They also have to write a letter to their family member. And a lot of times it may be granting forgiveness. So they're both asking for forgiveness from a victim and maybe granting forgiveness to some bad parents or whatever led them to be incarcerated. But the role of the church is very interesting. First of all, we are a faith-based organization.
Right.
So every week during the 14 weeks, the participants have to read scripture that relates to the topic. So on the night on accountability, there'll be some scriptures that relate to accountability. But what I have found is a lot of folks in church are really looking for an opportunity to serve and to make a difference. And, a lot of people, if you ask what's their typical week like, they go to work, they come home, they watch TV. Volunteers in our program really get to participate in making a difference in somebody's life. And so for the church, and it's interesting, I meet with churches all the time, and a lot of churches have great programs for widowers and orphans. The Bible says take care of widows and orphans, but also says take care of the inmates, the prisoners. And the opportunity for the church to connect with us to serve out that commandment of going to prison really connects with churches. So the opportunity is really, it's more of a discipleship opportunity because we cover topics like accountability, responsibility, confession, forgiveness, reconciliation. And because of the program, the church volunteers really gets to help in the reconciliation process of bringing offenders back to their families through this letter writing process and the fact that they change. So that's how that works.
And I love what you said right when you started answering that question, Jim, the idea of being able to confess. James 5:16 says, confess your sins one to another. And here's the part we leave out, and pray for one another so that what can happen? Forgiveness doesn't happen. Jesus is taking care of that. It's healing. So that we can actually find those moments of healing. What a great thing to be able to do and to see. So what are some of the things that as you think about this, Joel, and you think about the various men and women that you've watched walk through Bridges to Life and this, what are some of the things that you would look at and go, man, this is something good that happens that I never expected to see. I never thought might happen as a result of that. What kind of things like that have you seen as you've gone forward?
That journey happens in the volunteer's life, but it also happens in the offender's lives. And so, as far as an offender's perspective is concerned, but changing from kind of a demeanor of arms folded, weeks 1 and 2, where they're like, do I trust you, and just that simple change in developing a relationship with somebody that you've never met before, but you're able to connect with as a human being, despite the fact that we are entering these small groups in different demographics, different faiths that are present in the offenders that are coming in. in to participate in these small groups, but there's still that connection that you have sacrificed some time, some gasoline, some time with your family and your loved one to participate in this small group with me. It's unexpected every time it happens, and it happens every single circle with every single class. It just amazes me that can transpire every single time. The volunteers that come in that continue. I mean, we have relationships with the SMU campus here pretty locally, where students have volunteered their time initially as a part of a program, maybe a class project. We partner with some of the professors that are on the SMU campus, ACU, et cetera, and it's for a grade at first. They come in, they get that perspective change, they sit in the small groups, and then when it's not for a grade, when the class is over and the project is submitted, they continually come back every single semester. We have our 14-week program in the spring, again in the fall, and these students that are young in their lives, they have their whole life ahead of them. You wouldn't expect them to be the first ones to darken a doorstep for a prison, but they're willing to do that. Even as we transition and pivot in a COVID world like 2020 brought us, we transitioned our program to a self-study program where our volunteers are still engaged in reviewing the study guides, reviewing the progress that the offenders are making in their self-study, even though we're not allowed to go onto the units right now. You mentioned prayer earlier. I challenge my volunteer base to take a small group of men. I still have the rosters for the men that are participating, but I break them into the same size groups that they would have shepherded through that process. And so they're praying over those group of 10 men or those 10 women or those 10 juveniles that are going through our program in this specific period. We've got over 6,000 offenders that are participating in our program right now through the self-study program where no volunteers are allowed, but we've still actively engaged the church. We've still actively engaged our volunteer group, and we're still bringing hope and healing through the self-study program, even in a world where prison programs are not allowed currently. We're still active, and it's cool to see God work.
Man, and we are grateful, at least in the state of Texas, that that's beginning to open up.
Yes.
Started on the 15th of March and is going to kind of continue with that. If there's anything that we haven't talked about that you feel like is super important that we really understand, what would that look like? Is there anything we haven't covered that you feel like, man, I want this audience to understand, yeah, this is important for us to kind of look at as well? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, one of the things I'm thinking about is the 14th week, which is graduation, which is the culmination of the 14 weeks of change. And as I mentioned earlier, the graduates get a chance to share what they've learned. They also receive a certificate that they completed the program. And we hear each time, this is the first thing I've ever completed in my life.
Wow.
Now, and inmates in prison, they're from 18 to 80, to hear grown men and women that share they've never completed anything except our program, that's life-changing. The other that's really a kind of a visual affirmation is all the volunteers as well as the graduates receive a picture of their small group. And I hear church members say this all the time. My son's is a volunteer, and on his refrigerator, and a lot of our volunteers have places where they put these pictures. They've got picture after picture after picture on the refrigerator of all their graduates. And here's what they say. And I said, well, I asked my son, why do you do that? And he goes, well, Dad, every time I walk by the fridge, I pick somebody out and I pray for them. And we share with our graduates, you're going to have volunteers praying for you for the rest of your life. Do you know how life impacting that is?
Yeah.
For both the volunteer, the church member, as well as the graduate of the program in prison, to know that somebody's going to be praying for them. So the power of prayer is huge. And we appreciate the church praying for our program, as well as the impact that's made through the program.
That's awesome. What about you, Joel? Is there anything that comes to mind that you think, man, we need to cover that too? We missed that.
And it's neat to see the international and interstate response to what and we have states. I mean, we started in Texas, obviously, the John Sage story, as I mentioned earlier, but we now have relationships with other states where I have chaplains that are calling me, or even offenders of crime that are writing me saying, "Hey, man, we need this in our prison." I had an inmate in the state of Washington most recently write me and say, "I am in a unit that doesn't have Bridges to Life, but I just stood before the parole board, and the parole board said, we're going to deny your parole right now, but at your next parole review, if you've taken Bridges to Life, then we will approve your parole, and your parole will be approved. So you'll be able to re-enter society." And so I love. I mean, he's obviously asking us for our program to come to that unit, and we were able to launch at that unit, which is super exciting. But that is a pat on our back, saying, "Man, this is something that people are taking." Taking notice of for a restorative justice purpose, and it's obviously God's healing that is occurring. These inmates, once they do re-enter, though, I have to also include our need for re-entry, the need that an offender faces, multiple needs. I mean, housing, clothing. I just picked up my brother-in-law who was incarcerated for aggravated robbery, and his immediate need, as soon as he left those prison walls, for clothing, for emotional support, for legal counsel, for a house and a job and everything else that comes with that. What that looks like is overwhelming. We don't want to just focus our program on these 14 weeks and say, "Here's your certificate of completion. I'm glad you had a heart and mind change about life and your reaction to crime and victimization." We also want to meet those needs. And so we work with organizations, nonprofits, many of which that are going to be here in the seminar, that we connect the offender. We're in prisons weekly, and we connect the offender with those loving people on the outside that are able to meet those needs. We want to meet those needs on the outside. We want to connect the church to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think you just said it. I mean, it's another opportunity for the church to engage to help returning citizens as well as those that are incarcerated. Man, it is so encouraging to hear what you guys are doing. So encouraging to know that, man, you have taken some of the biggest hurts that a human being can have, and you've repurposed them for the gospel. And that is its own amazing story as men and women come to know Christ because of the work that you're doing. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.